Thank you very much for inviting me here, and I look forward to a useful debate here. I think that Hamza has at most made a case, and I would argue not a successful one, but has most made a case for the idea that something that was uncaused caused the universe to exist. Now that may well be true. It doesn't say anything about the attributes that are normally associated with gods, which include not only causing the universe to exist, but also typically intervening in the day-to-day affairs of the universe, usually on behalf of the interests of human beings on the planet Earth. And also that gods are typically seen to be in some way the source of our morality. Now I'm going to address all three of those areas: the idea of the creation of the universe, the idea of gods intervening in the day-to-day operations of the universe, and the idea of gods being the source of our morality. With regard to the creation of the universe, I'm going to phrase it as the beginning of the universe, rather than use a religiously loaded phrase like creation. Every generation we discover more about how the universe operates, and every generation a lot of us describe the parts that we don't yet understand by saying that gods did it. And every generation we shift more and more explanations from the category of we think that a god did it to the category of we now understand how it happens naturally. And things never move in the other direction. We don't have explanations that at one stage a scientific explanation was the best, and now we realise actually that was wrong, it was a god that did it. There's a relentless move of us finding out more and more that things that we used to believe gods caused actually happen naturally. With regard to what we understand about how the universe came about, that pattern is evident. First of all, at one stage we thought that the earth was flat and the heavens were above it. Then we thought that the earth was at the centre of the cosmos, and that the sun and the moon and the stars moved around the earth. Then we found out that in fact the sun, the stars and the earth, that our planets move around the sun, and then we discovered that our sun was only one of many suns and was in fact just another star like the stars that we see in the sky distant from us. We discovered that gravity and not the gods is what held and holds the planets in orbit. And we discovered that all of these stars are moving away from each other at an increasing speed, and could calculate the speed by scientific observation. And then worked backwards from that if everything is moving away from everything else at these speeds, you can run the film backwards, so to speak, to discover and calculate that at one stage, about 14 billion years ago, that everything in the universe was contained and expanded from a tiny singularity. Now we still have the question, as is typically answered by religious people with God as the answer, the question of what happened before the Big Bang, what caused the Big Bang to happen. And the answer is, we don't know. But on the basis of the relentless pattern of religious explanations being overtaken by scientific explanations, it's safe to assume that unless we have overwhelming evidence to the contrary, that when we do find the answer, that it will be a natural one and not a supernatural one. In many ways, the question of before the Big Bang is meaningless in the context of the use of language we normally use with the word before. But for the sake of the debate tonight, if we run with the idea that something uncaused caused the universe, nobody has, or Hamza certainly hasn't put forward any evidence to suggest any of the attributes of that, other than taking a leap of logic out of nowhere to suggest that therefore it must have a mind, therefore it must have consciously chosen. No evidence at all to back that leap, and from that leap onwards, Hamza's argument collapses in a rational sense. he moves on to the idea of fine-tuning, and the bases that on the idea that the universe is fine-tuned for life. But actually most of the universe isn't fine-tuned for life. There's 100 billion galaxies, each of which has about 100 billion stars like our sun. Our sun has a number of planets revolving around it, one of which so far we've discovered is suitable for life. I think it's likely there is life elsewhere in the universe, but the amount we've found so far indicates that most of the universe is not fine-tuned for life. And if we talk about human life, most of Earth is not fine-tuned for human life. The idea of a God that fine-tuned, and I'll now move on to the second of the overall attributes I think is normally attributed to gods, that they intervene in the day-to-day affairs of the universe on behalf of humans and the interests of humans, is something that would have made sense generations ago when humans thought that the Earth played a major role in the universe, because it seems to us to be much bigger than it actually is in reality. And the more we understand about how insignificant the Earth is in the overall scheme of things, the less likely it seems that a God is intervening on behalf of humans. To believe that, what you would have to believe is that this entity created the universe. As I say, the known universe, 100 billion galaxies with 100 billion stars in each, and then waited 14 billion years, and then said, I'll pick just this galaxy out of the 100 billion, and within that I'll pick just this star out of the 100 billion stars, and then I'll pick this planet revolving around that star, and I'll pick one of the millions of species that exist on that planet, and I'll pick one of the individual members of that species, and I'll tell him that it's really important that he doesn't trim his beard and that he doesn't gather sticks on the Sabbath. It's an extraordinary set of priorities for a being that is purported to have created a universe that vast, and it's extraordinarily arrogant of humans to think that we are at the centre of that creation, and that creation has come about for our benefit. I'm going to move on now to probably the most harmful, I think, of the effects of supernatural thinking about gods, which is the idea that gods have not only, and I say gods plural because whatever God you believe in and whatever religion you believe in, most people on earth don't believe that. You're in a minority, whatever your belief is. And atheists are in each of those majorities that don't believe in each of the individual gods. We just take it that step further and don't believe in any of them. The idea that a God has created our morality has a number of problems. The first is that most of us, whether we're religious or not, we intuitively recognise that morality has to do with how we treat other sentient beings. We intuitively recognise that if we unnecessarily cause suffering to other sentient beings, that that's morally wrong, and that if we help other sentient beings to flourish, that that's morally right. And as Sam Harris put it in his latest book, The Moral Landscape, he said the only assumption that you have to make is to recognise that the worst possible of all worlds would be one in which every sentient being suffered to the maximal extent for no reason. And that every step away from that is a step towards goodness, and every step towards that situation is a step towards badness. And a question then arises of where does our sense of morality come from? And that question is typically answered by religious people by saying it comes from a God, and by atheists by saying we have to figure it out for ourselves. And in practical terms, I'm going to suggest that that distinction is a bit of a distraction, because if the idea of right and wrong come from somewhere else, external to our minds, then our task together living on this planet is to identify what those principles of right and wrong are. If it is something that happens subjectively within our minds, then our task is to agree together what right and wrong are. But irrespective of where we see the source of right and wrong, the task remains the same, living on this small planet, that we have to work out together what we understand to be right and wrong. And if you make an appeal to gods, you run into two problems. The first, as we're all aware, is that different people believe that different gods are telling them that different things are right and wrong. And indeed, even when people believe in the same God, different people believe that the same God is telling them that different things are right and wrong. That's even putting aside the fact that there's no evidence that the God exists. The more important issue with regard to, just philosophically, with regards to whether right and wrong come from gods is an issue that was addressed by Plato centuries ago, the Euthyphro dilemma. And that is, if you ask yourself, if you believe in a God, does that God decree things to be right and wrong simply on a whim because it believes that, could have chosen that randomly torturing people for fun is morally good, happened to choose that it's morally bad, but could have chosen the other? Or if that disturbs your idea of what a God is and you say, no, God couldn't really have done that, what you're recognizing is that your God is identifying what is right and wrong based on some sort of objective criteria that are independent of that God. And so, irrespective of whether you believe that a God exists, you cannot take the step to say that that God is the source of morality unless you accept that it's just purely a whim of that God and it could just as easily have chosen to make randomly torturing people for fun morally good instead of morally bad. So that really puts atheists and religious people on the same plane of trying to identify together what's right and what's wrong and how best we can live together with mutual respect on this planet. So to summarise there, the three issues that I think are the core issues in arguing whether or not a God exists. And they address the three properties or attributes that are typically attributed to gods. The first is that a God caused the universe to exist. And I'm suggesting there that it's more persuasive to say that when we do find out how the universe came to exist, that it'll be a natural answer. The second is the idea that gods intervene in the day-to-day life of the universe on behalf of human beings, one species on one planet in one of 100 billion suns in one of 100 billion galaxies, which I think is extraordinarily unlikely, to put it mildly. And the third is the idea that our sense of morality comes from gods, and I hope that I have suggested that there is enough evidence to conclude that our morality is intuitive, and if it is indeed objective, that it comes from elsewhere than gods. Thank you very much.